Chapter 38. Mike. Scrambling to get off the hotel property and back to the boat, Mike had to shake his head in amazement at what he'd just experienced. The Doc Emily encounter was so incredibly surreal that for a moment he wondered if he had imagined it. The empty leg holster assured him he had not. Once they reached the boat, they found Rostam waiting anxiously while their prisoner remained slumped in the bottom of the boat, his face ashen and twisted in pain. Although Mike wasn't a man to cause another man, even an enemy, undue pain, he struggled with his own lack of empathy for the KPA soldier. On one hand, the man was probably powerless in what he did and where he was sent. The KPA wasn't the United States Army, full of volunteers. It was an oppressive institute in an even more despotic country, ruled by a merciless leader. The fact remained that the KPA man was on U.S. soil, and for that reason alone, Mike was mostly indifferent to the man's comfort or health, other than the Korean surviving the ride to the LZ, where his mind could be wrung clean of any and all useful intel. As soon as the Green Berets were seated, Rostam started the boat's engine and puttered away from the muddy shore. As the water deepened, he applied throttle, lifting the nose and dropping the stern lower in the water as the boat gained speed. Shortly after they pulled away, Mike gestured to Tim, signaling him to keep an eye open. He then set about refilling the fuel bladder from one of the fuel cans siphoned from the Audi at the hotel. He faced the rear of the boat as he sloshed fuel into the bladder with a view of their wake in the murky water. The sight was soothing, even peaceful, he thought as he drank in the rare moment of tranquility. In another world, he might have been out here with friends, some of whom would likely have been female, and they would have undoubtedly been drinking a few beers and maybe even fished a little. His mind drifted to Doc Emily, and suddenly his focus was no longer on his mission. He recalled her delicate presence, standing so unexpectedly in the parking lot, and her yellow, sleeveless summer dress with its spaghetti straps and faint, almost transparent floral pattern. She had worn an oversized jacket that looked like it had been left behind by one of the maintenance workers, but the front had been open, exposing her dress. The weather was cooling. Today was overcast, threatening rain. Perhaps that's why he'd offered to secure a more suitable wardrobe collection for the pretty doctor. He told himself that, again, and then a third time before he recognized that he was trying to convince himself of something that wasn't entirely true. He wanted to talk to Doc Emily again, which was strange and marginally irritating, that a woman he'd just met had made such an impression on him. And the fact that he was thinking about her again after arranging to meet her a second time, all in the name of tactical medicine and proper wardrobe procurement. He was also embarrassed, knowing none of it had been lost on Tim, yet his partner hadn't voiced a single word about the matter. If Mike brought it up now, he'd appear defensive and open himself up for ridicule. Whether it was playful or serious didn't much matter, so he kept his thoughts about the good doctor to himself. While he thought about Doc Emily and the position he'd placed himself in, not once did the thought of not returning to the hotel cross his mind. Rubbing his middle fingers roughly behind his ears, he tried to refocus. Frustrated with his sudden and very juvenile-like attraction to Emily, he grabbed his rifle and began scanning the riverbanks for any sign of a threat or other hostile force. They motored past old, vacant, ramshackle river houses, docks with no apparent ties to any structure, and some areas where the shoreline was low enough to see out into the fields that accounted for most of the undeveloped land in the Paintersville and Cortland areas. At one point, Mike saw Tim check his map, then pull out the team radio. He couldn't hear what Tim was saying over the rumble of the boat's engine, but he could assume Tim was vectoring and confirming the location of the LZ with either the pilots or the people back in Fallon. When Tim pushed the radio and his handset back inside his pack, he came up and gave Mike a thumbs up. That meant they were on schedule. The bird was on schedule, and the LZ hadn't been changed. If the LZ changed, that could have posed a myriad of problems, depending on where the new location was. If the bird was late, they would need to find a safe loitering location and hunker down until the Army pilots could get their act together and get to the LZ. If his team was late, no helicopter would wait around. Combat operations were some of, if not the most challenging events to plan, coordinate, and execute. A flawed $100,000 wedding would result in a couple of things: a lot of gossip and a crying bride. A flawed combat operation usually resulted in millions of dollars in equipment loss and the loss of human life. The stakes in what Mike and Tim did could not be compared to any other business in the world, so Mike was relieved when Tim gave him the international sign for everything's good. Still, with a thumbs up, planning, and radio communications, they arrived at the LZ ahead of the helicopter crew. The location was a flat stretch of field to the rear parking lot of a furniture rental warehouse. There were chain-link fences that would at the very least slow anyone curious about a helicopter landing behind the warehouse. The field dropped off into the river, perfect for them to pull up to as their airborne brethren arrived. When the LZ was within sight, Mike asked Rostam to throttle back and approach the long stretch of open area at roughly 5 knots. Since they weren't able to hear the beating blades of the incoming aircraft, they kept their eyes glued to the skies, searching for their resupply bird. Pulling to a stop at the edge of the LZ, Mike and Tim leapt from the boat. "Watch him and get this thing turned around and facing the way we came in case we've all got to leave in a hurry," Mike told Rostam, before he turned and worked his way up the steep embankment. At the top of the embankment, they set up a hasty security position, lying prone and seeing no sign of life. The area they'd chosen for the LZ was mostly industrial, and Mike figured most folks would have abandoned these areas by now. Dangerous places were more likely to be in the neighborhoods and anywhere food was previously stored or sold. Laying there on his stomach, he recognized a snag in their operation in the way of a security fence running along the backside of the entire industrial area. The fence separated the river from the business and appeared to be 6 feet in height, with rolled razor wire strung along its top. "We've got to cut that before they get here," he said, pointing in the obstacle's direction. "Go. I'll check on the bird again." Tim reached for his pack on the ground to his right. Mike rolled to his side and slid his pack off. Reaching into an external pouch, he withdrew a set of wire snips and moved forward. At the fence, he knelt and began the tedious task of clipping each piece of connective wire until the fence was open all the way to the top metal support beam. He cut 2 loops of wire that held the top of the fence in place, then kicked at the mesh and watched it fall to the side. Once the fence lay open like the flaps of a tent, he moved back to the edge of the embankment and resumed his position next to Tim. 15 tenuous minutes later, they could hear the sound of rotor blades approaching from the east. The 2 Green Berets hadn't seen a soul out or about as they lay in wait for the helicopter, but with the way the sound thundered throughout the region, they were sure someone would come to investigate. A twin-engine Sea Knight swept down the river from the east, crossing over the LZ before banking as the aircraft made a wide, arcing turn to the north. The helicopter was a Marine Corps aircraft, probably brought up from Camp Pendleton after the lights went out, Mike figured. Off in the not-so-far distance, they heard more helicopter blades, and 2 Apache attack helicopters swept across the terrain, searching for potential threats to their escort. The Apaches were higher than the CH-46, but not as high as Mike was used to seeing the gunship's crews. If the CH-46 Sea Knight were piloted by men from Fort Campbell or the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the aircraft would have flown straight into the LZ. Instead, it passed over the top to inspect the area for obstacles before it flew in a circle to get back on a proper final approach, all the while alerting every single good, bad, or indifferent guy in the area to their presence. More worrisome was that the aircraft could simply lift off and be gone if a group of hostiles threatened it. He and Mike would be left to manage whatever mess the less experienced pilots had created. Mike didn't blame the men or women flying the CH-46 and knew they were doing the best they could, considering the country's predicament and their abilities. Part of him wanted to climb on board and be done with all the sneaking around his own country, but knew that would not be in the cards for a long while. He squinted into the bright sky as the helicopter leveled off on final approach and descended steadily toward the flat ground in front of him. He hoped the pilots had seen them on the edge of the embankment and landed the big twin-engine beast as close as possible. He wasn't at all keen on running 200 yards across open ground in order to deliver the prisoner and then retrieve supplies. The supplies would be dumped off the aircraft's rear ramp, he knew, and he and Tim would be left to make trip after trip to and from their boat. Like every other helicopter landing he'd seen, this one was loud and dusty, stirring up a cloud of dust that, for a few seconds, cloaked the entire aircraft in a shroud of roiling dirt. As soon as the helicopter was on the ground and the pilot lowered the collective, the dust was pushed away by the now mostly inert, but still idly whirling main rotor blades. 4 men leapt from the rear ramp and assumed defensive positions as Mike stood and waved. He could see the 2 pilots seated in the front of the aircraft, their faces mostly covered by helmet visors and headsets. The moment the helicopter touched down, Tim slid down the embankment. He returned, dragging the pale-faced POW up the slope with more than a little effort. Below him, Mike could see Rostam's anxious face peering up the incline, his hand holding the boat steady along the shore. It was Rostam's first helicopter operation, and he was in awe of the size and chaos created by the flying machine. Everything was going swimmingly, Mike thought to himself with a sardonic snort. Right when an operator thought things would work out was usually the time some fly in the ointment showed up. When Tim and the white-faced Korean came abreast of him, Mike got back to his feet, grabbed one of the KPA man's arms, and assisted in dragging him toward the waiting helicopter. As suspected, other men still aboard were tossing bags and crates down the back ramp of the idling CH-46 Sea Knight. Rounding the end of the aircraft, they came face to face with a burly man wearing civilian clothing, but kitted up with armor and weapons. He didn't look like the CIA men Mike had worked around in the Middle East, and he wondered who the man was. The burly man looked to be in his early 40s, so Mike guessed he wasn't operational in the sense Mike and Tim were when the country was plunged into the Dark Ages. Without a word, the burly man reached out and grabbed the KPA soldier from them, swung him around, and shoved him roughly back up the ramp. He planted the man on a canvas bench along one of the bulkheads and sat directly across from the wounded Korean. He just stared at the man, not giving Mike or Tim a second look. When the last of the resupply containers was haphazardly tossed to the dirt behind the helicopter, someone must have made a radio call because all 4 security guys got to their feet and raced back aboard the Big Bird. 2 of the security men halted on the helicopter's ramp to snap into a safety harness, then took a knee, facing out the rear of the helicopter. One gave the Green Berets a little nod, while the second man rendered a smart salute as the pitch of the helicopter's turbine engine changed from a high-toned whine to a rumbling roar as the pilots applied pitch to the blades, gathering the collective. As the huge Marine helicopter went light on its wheels, Mike and Tim began gathering the resupplied containers and carrying them back to the boat. Mike glanced up once as the helicopter lifted into the air, its flanks bristling with the tips of .50 caliber machine guns. The 2 Marines on the ramp swept their weapons across the area in search of possible surface-to-air threats. The dissipating sound of the lumbering aircraft served to remind them that they'd almost certainly have curious people on top of their location in short order. It took them 3 trips to load the supplies brought in by the jarheads, and the load pushed the boat down in the water much lower than it sat on the ride into Sacramento area. Rostam needed no orders to leave the area when they finished, locking the transmission into reverse and backing the severely overloaded vessel away from the shore. He'd spent the past several minutes nervously looking around for people attracted by the thunderous noise of the helicopter and was shocked when no one showed up to cause trouble for them. Once there was enough room to clear the nose of the boat, Rostam shifted the engine and applied a gradual feed of throttle. The boat felt sluggish as the motor churned water into a wake and the nose rose, but only slightly. He wasn't all that sure the boat wouldn't sink once they were out on the bay with choppier waters, but at the same time, there wasn't much he could do about it. If they sank, he'd swim, and if they made it, he'd thank his lucky stars. Although he watched their front, Rostam's eyes kept flashing down to the water outside the boat that nearly came over the sides. If that happened, there would be no stopping it, and they would lose everything not attached to their bodies. Mike noticed Rostam's worried glances at the water line outside the boat and leaned over. Cutting it close, I guess. Rostam nodded. We're way too heavy. Mike barked out a short laugh. Should we toss Tim over? Rostam didn't laugh. If water starts in, we're losing everything. Then we're walking back. Take it nice and slow then. No sudden acceleration or decrease in speed, and we should be fine. The bay is what I think will sink us, man, Rostam responded. We need a bigger boat. Less weight, Mike countered. Okay, less weight, whatever it takes. Mike turned and scanned the river ahead for a moment before he swiveled back to Rostam. We need to make a stop at a place that has clothes. Rostam searched Mike's face for some sign he was joking, but found none. You're serious? Dead. Rostam's mouth parted slightly as he thought about where they were. I know a place, maybe. Ahead of us by a golf course. Daring and I stopped at the golf course before for lunch, and there was a shopping area across from it, like sporting goods, an Old Navy, and a Chick-fil-A. I remember because the golf guys wouldn't let us in the clubhouse without collared shirts, so we walked to Chick-fil-A and ate. Stop there, Mike said, then turned and joined Tim at the front of the boat. Together, he and Tim began unpacking everything they could and tossing the material used for packaging into the water. The ammunition was enclosed in wooden crates. Those were broken open and discarded. After 30 minutes, the bottom of the boat was littered with loose items and green ammunition cans, but the boat rode a little higher in the water. 2 hours later, Mike and Tim were back in the boat. They'd gone ashore at the golf course, moved to the shopping center suggested by Rostam, and found the clothing Mike had promised Emily. There had actually been a 511 tactical store in the shopping center, which stunned them. They'd gathered a few things from the 511 store, then moved to the Old Navy store for more everyday wear clothes for Doc Emily. As they neared the hotel, Rostam slowed the boat, pulled up closer to the dock, and throttled back slowly and evenly so it settled into the water as squarely as could be expected. He managed to avoid as much rocking stem to stern as possible as he drew alongside the dock. When the dock was within a couple feet of the boat, Mike and Tim stepped out of the boat and onto the dock's wooden decking, making Rostam's job a little less worrisome. Their resupply had come in the way of not only the Switchblade drones, but 6 extra M4 rifles, 6 Glock 17 pistols, and ammunition for both weapon systems. When the boat stopped, Mike knelt on the deck and grabbed 2 ammo cans, one with 9mm ammunition and the other with 5.56mm rounds for the rifle. I'll be right back, Mike told Tim, by way of letting the other Green Beret know his help wouldn't be needed to deliver clothing and weapons rations for the week to Doc Emily. If only they knew, Tim murmured, shaking his head like an unapproving father. What? We were tasked with organizing civilians to resist. That's what I'm doing, Mike said irritably. Rostam, hand me that bag of clothes, please. Rostam tossed the bag of clothing to him and watched as Mike skulked off, mumbling something about people minding their own business.